I'd like to thank Brian and the rest of the XCOM for inviting me to do this. It's occurred to me for some time that it would be a useful boost in my self-esteem if I was ever asked to talk in a plenary session, and here we are. Unfortunately, the topic Brian asked me to talk about is one that I knew absolutely nothing about 10 years ago. And as I think will become abundantly clear over the course of the talk, no, not a hell of a lot more now. So I'm going to feel better about myself after this, but I'm not sure you guys are going to know any more after this. I'm going to be talking about the on-the-ground creel surveys and what we've been looking at Oneida, and some of the things we've learned or things we've tried to learn and failed. But before I get going too much, I want to say that the credit for most of the data, in fact almost all of it, goes to Scott Krueger, who is our creel clerk during most of the years that we've collected these data. Someday I hope they will appear in his master's thesis, but I'm going to be up here talking, but I want to make sure you know that this is all due to Scott's efforts through the years. So why do we do creel surveys? Most of us, I think, our training was to play with fish, play with habitats, and study the biology and ecology of systems. And in as much as it was possible, at least when I was in school, we kind of tried to avoid the anglers because they can be eccentric. The ones that make the most noise tend to be the most eccentric. And we also weren't entirely sure we could get information from them that's useful. We're talking about blogs and the internet, and here's just a couple picked off Ice Shanty posted within the last week, I think. And we learn a lot of things. I did a survey on fisheries education, talking to agencies about what the students who were graduating lack, and one of the things they mentioned was that we don't have a very good mastery of English. Well, the first post indicates that we share that with our angling group, but this guy's talking about, well, you had a goose egg and then 4 shorties, so we can get some catch data there, but no idea what the size is. The other worry about not being on the lake looking at the anglers is sometimes they don't give us the most reliable information. The second post talks about a guy who with his parents was catching flathead catfish in New York and on Oneida Lake for years and years, and he's convinced they're still there. And just in case you find out, the range of flathead falls well short of the border of New York State. There's never been one reported in the state to my knowledge. So I'm not sure if we take this catch data and put a whole lot of store in it. But before we discount anglers entirely as being reliable sources, here's a post that I think proves at least some of them know what they're talking about. Well, here is, I believe the state and Cornell have a very good handle on the fishery and do an excellent job managing it. So not all of them are unreliable. Some have very shrewd insights. So, well, I had to get something up on this slide. So we can learn something from the anglers. And more importantly, we can't ignore these people because they are, in fact, our bread and butter. They spend an awful lot of money, something like $41.8 billion spent on fishing-related expenditures during 2011. This is not small potatoes. And in addition to a poor mastery of our own English language, they share other priorities with us. If you look at the distribution of expenditures, equipment, lodging, licenses, there's this one category called other trip costs, and I can't for the life of me think of anything that could be but beer, and that's about how much money the meeting budget allocates to beer. So we have that in common. So maybe we could get along with these folks and learn something from them at the same time. And lastly, if you look at where the money comes into the agency and where the money goes out, and of course some of that money comes in and supports my job, and lots of us are dependent on the agency's generosity to have employment. The anglers account for a lot of the money that's flowing in and out of the agency, so if we ignore them, it's at our own peril. And we do need to pay attention to their satisfaction with the resource and be sensitive to their needs. So whether we want to go out and talk to anglers or not, creel surveys should be an essential part of fisheries management for a variety of reasons. We can monitor effort, the pressure on resources, or the changes that we need to be aware of that a lake that normally was not fished that heavily suddenly has a lot of effort, which might entail keeping more attention on the fish populations. We want to monitor catch in frequent cases, including New York State's walleye management plan. The management objective is catch rate based. We want to have X number of fisheries with catch rates of this. Well, how can we see if we're doing a good job managing if we don't know what the catch rates actually are? And in other cases, it's fairly important to monitor harvest to make sure our fisheries are sustainable. Oneida experiences a great deal of walleye and yellow perch harvest, and we need to know what's going on with those trends to make sure that the populations are still viable and we'll have fishing opportunities in the future. And finally, I won't get into it much, but we want to know what the attitudes and opinions of anglers are. The ones that call us on the phone and email us are unhappy. If you go out on the lake, you tend to run into more people who are content than you do if you just sit back in your office and wait for the phone to ring. And also look at demographics, socioeconomics, and that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do with today's talk is talk a little bit about how creel surveys are designed. It's not something I'm an expert in, but I'm going to talk about what the conventions are, what the different components are, how they're typically conducted, what people think the best way is, and some studies we've done to see whether or not that's true or we could do different things. The Bible is Ken Pollock's book on angler survey methods. It's now out of print at the American Fisheries Society. If you have a copy, it turns out they're quite collectible now. There's 2 used copies available on Amazon for $250 a piece. I did a more extensive used book search because I am a book collector and found one for only $240, so I can give somebody that. If you are a student and you need this book, I guess the solace is you can get free 2-day shipping for your $250 book. But this is, in fact, where you go to find out how to do a creel survey, not listening to me. For a traditional on-the-ground creel survey, there's 2 components. You have to estimate effort. How many people are fishing for how long, how much fishing is taking place on your lake. And then you can do interviews. This is counting from a distance or on the lake itself. And then you do interviews to calculate catch and harvest rates. If all you care about is effort, you can do that and forget interviews. If all you care about is catch in a vacuum from effort and harvest, you can just do interviews. If you want to estimate harvest, you have to do the whole kit and caboodle. Effort is essentially counting boats or anglers, looking at how long they could be out there fishing, catch rates. You interview folks how long you've been fishing, how much have you caught, you get a catch rate. And if you want to calculate harvest, you do effort times the harvest rate and say, well, our guys took 60,000 walleye out of Levada Lake this year. But as mentioned in the last talk, creel surveys are labor intensive and they're very expensive. And I have not heard anyone talk recently about an increase in the flow of funds into the agency or any other organization trying to monitor fisheries. So this is a very labor intensive, very costly activity. We want to try to be as efficient as we can. Sadly, most of the conventions, what's the best way to do a creel survey, are not necessarily aimed at efficiency. To do it right, you have to spend a lot of time and a lot of money. So first, I'm going to talk about effort data collection. So I mentioned essentially effort involves counting, something almost anybody can do. 2 different approaches. Instantaneous counts are essentially if you have a vantage point where you can see the entire system and count all the anglers in a really short period of time. There's this many people out on the lake. In some systems that's quite feasible. This is the preferred method for estimating effort. You do 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 instantaneous counts a day, get average effort. The other option required in some systems are progressive counts, where you can't see the whole lake and you have a clerk who's moving through the system and counting boats as they go. Typically for efficiency's sake and in order to save money, we'd like to have the clerk interviewing and counting at the same time so that you're getting double bang for your buck. You don't want to pay a clerk to spend an entire day just driving around the lake and counting because you're not getting that critical interview data. If you could combine both of those in the same activity, that would be better. So some systems are really good for instantaneous counts. You get up on a good vantage point, you can see the whole lake from one spot with binoculars or spotting scope, you count all the boats, and then you have an effort estimate. Other lakes are not that conducive to that. We have lakes like Lake George and other lakes in New York that are just like that. There is no one place you can do the count. So this is a case where we want to do a progressive count and have the clerk run through the system. Or drive around and count from several different points. The problem is that almost all previous research suggests that the progressive counts underestimate effort relative to instantaneous counts because of a phenomenon called shadowing, which I will try to describe to you. Imagine you have a system, space here and time here, so different anglers coming on the lake in different places at different times, fishing for a certain amount of time, and then exiting the lake. You have counts going on during that fishing day. If you have an instantaneous count, get there and look across the lake, you get 6 of the 9 anglers that were out there during that day from your instantaneous count. If you pay your clerk to move through the system very rapidly, don't stop and don't do interviews, just run through doing nothing but counting. So the clerk starts here, time goes by as they cross the system. Now they've captured 5 out of the 9 anglers that were out there, not too different from the instantaneous count. If you have a clerk moving much more slowly, because they're interviewing as they go, you start having people leave the system before they get there, and in this case we only captured 2 of the 9. So this is where this idea of underestimating effort because of the shadowing effect comes in. The instantaneous count said 6. A directed progressive count, as hurriedly as you can do, got 5. But if you try to combine interviews and counting at the same time, we wind up with 2. ideally, if you have to have a clerk on the water to count, you'd like to interview. Interviewing takes a lot of time. The error structure of these catch rate estimates are such that the more interviews you get, the better. That's always the case. But you don't want to run around and just get 2 interviews. So all the time spent counting exclusively is time you lose getting interviews. So to combine those two would be quite desirable. If you're using your boat to drive around in circles and count, and then you go back out and get an interview, you're putting more wear and tear on your equipment. If you hire clerks with the same kind of discernment that we do, you use a boat enough times and at some point they sink it. So the less time you can have people out in boats, the better. You want to be as efficient with your time as you can. All this stuff costs money. So Brian mentioned we do our work on Oneida Lake. This is a lake that actually turns out to be consistent with instantaneous counts. It's a large lake, but well, as I'll mention, we have a tower where you can see most of it. A hugely intensely fished lake for walleye, yellow perch, and black bass. And we have research funded by DEC. So we made it abundantly clear to DEC years ago that efficiency was really not what we specialized in. So we have enough funding to do everything 2 or 3 different ways and kind of answer these questions. Again, as I mentioned, we have a tower that's 10 meters tall, right in our point in the middle of the South Shore. With the spotting scope, we can see the vast majority of the lake surface area, so we can do instantaneous counts. We did send the clerk out to do the interviews, and we went ahead and had them pretend to be doing a progressive count at the same time so we could compare the results of the instantaneous count and progressive count, see if it is in fact true that the progressive counts underestimate. Our design for the roving progressive count matches what Pollock says are the best case scenario. Instead of getting bogged down in one end of the lake doing interviews, we have checkpoints so that the clerk spends only a certain amount of time in each area of the lake, so that within a fixed time they do the whole circuit. And then all that randomness nonsense that statisticians get so hooped up about, starting a random place, move in random directions, all that kind of craziness. So we have the tower counts. Instantaneous counts, what the gold standard, I guess, of creel surveys. We have the progressive counts, and our goal is to see if the numbers were the same. In a lake where instantaneous counts are not as easy as they are on Oneida Lake, it would be really swell if we found progressive counts while doing interviews produce roughly the same method estimates, because then you can be more efficient with your clerk count. Instantaneous counts from the tower twice a day, 2 weekdays, both weekend days, every week. Boat categories, fishing, wake, or other, and I'll talk about that a little bit. We've also adjusted this for aerial counts to correct for the part of the lake we can't see from the tower. When you're in a tower, you can't, the boats that are close, you can tell exactly what they're doing, but from a distance, remember it's 10 miles in either direction from our tower where the boats are, you have to be a little bit more coarse in how you regulate it. So any boat that was not moving, that wasn't a sailboat or a tugboat or some clearly non-fishing boat, was classified as a fishing boat. A boat generating weight, traveling faster than would be used patrolling, we consider non-fishing. And then the others, moving or not moving, if we can identify them for sure, like sailboats, it's not fishing, we don't count. But there are people, surprisingly enough, who go out in boats that look like they'd be perfectly good to fish from, and all they do is sit in the boats and drink beer. But from 10 miles away, you can't tell. So those boats might get counted as fishing boats. One of the advantages of the progressive counts is you can actually get closer and tell when somebody's disguising themselves as fishermen when in fact all they're doing is drinking. Aerial adjustment worked out quite well. We did this back in the late 1990s before I got there, but we have a good correlation between what the plane counts were and what the tower counts were, so we're pretty confident in our tower counts. Progressive methods, as I mentioned, moving around the area, we had 8 sections, 45 minutes in each section. So the clerk goes to a section, counts all the boats, interviews for 45 minutes, and then moves to the next section, regardless of whether or not they had time to interview everybody who was there. A little bit finer resolution in terms of fishing and non-fishing based on being close enough to tell what people are up to in their boats. And then we did paired tests. We compared days when we had both instantaneous and progressive counts to see whether or not we got different effort estimates. Amazingly enough, the results pretty much agree with what the textbooks say. Instantaneous counts, 2 of the 3 years produced significantly higher estimates of the number of boats on the lake than the progressive counts did. This is what would be predicted by theory. The progressive counts underestimate relative to instantaneous counts. Look at it in terms of months. Again, same kind of trend. Progressive counts almost always lower, but in this case only 1 month significant. The sample sizes are so much higher for the annual counts that you're going to get more significance in the monthly counts. Carry out the other 2 years, 2004, would have been ideal. We saw no difference at all. That would have been a great finding. 2005 went the other direction, much more consistent significance and higher instantaneous counts. So not pretty good agreement from year to year. Tower counts tended to be higher effort estimates than the progressive counts, but a little bit of noise there. Some years it was worse than others, and significance was not always the case. But we started to think a little bit more about this. Previous research suggests progressive counts underestimate effort. Our results on the surface agree with that, but it also is possible that because you can't see the boats as close, the tower counts are farther away, that we might be overestimating fishing effort with the tower counts relative to what we get with progressive counts. And this is kind of what happens. It's not always easy from a distance to tell who's fishing or not. This is the International Eel Pout Festival. If you read the blog associated with that, not all of those people are fishing. There are other priorities that they have for that weekend in Walker, Minnesota. My guess is not all these guys are fishing. So from a distance you can tell angler, but when you're counting that from a tower, how many of those boats are fishing, how many are not? How many of those ice folks are making a beer run? How many are actually trying to catch an eel pout? So we started to kind of divide up what the difference between the tower and progressive counts was based on time of day. We look at the early morning counts, actually have cases where the progressive counts are higher than the tower counts. This would probably be accounted for by anglers fishing very close to shore, where you can't pick them up from the tower. But as you move into the midday and afternoon, is when you see the biggest difference between tower and progressive, with the tower counts being higher, resulting in higher effort estimates. So why would we care about time of day? We do have a survey with a postcard that gave us some idea of what the diel cycle of our anglers' effort was. And they tend to get out on the water fairly early in the morning, peak about 8:30 or so, and then kind of trail off towards late morning, midday, where there's not that much angling effort late in the afternoon, which is about the exact same time that the non-fishing boats come out. Folks are out there doing something other than fishing. So there may not be that big a cycle in the number of boats on the lake, but there is a big cycle in the number of anglers on the lake. And as I mentioned before, at the 60-time spotting scope, it's really hard to tell who's fishing and who's not once the boats are 4 or 5 miles away. Two more years of these morning versus afternoon counts. 2004 kind of agreed that the biggest differences were the late day, where the tower counted more boats than the progressive guy did. The progressive guy, again, remember, discerning better between fishing and non-fishing boats in the tower. 2005 kind of blew that up. Good evidence that a 2-year study would have been perfectly appropriate, because the third year kind of started to throw us off what we thought we were seeing here. In both cases, both times a day, tower counts were higher. So the book says, if at all possible, do instantaneous counts. If not possible, then put your clerk on doing nothing but counting to get to count as quickly as you can, and don't interview. For the most part, we can't deny that our data suggests that that's true. Instantaneous counts gave us higher effort estimates that would support the idea that progressive counts were underestimates, but the differences weren't consistent across years or seasons. So there's enough noise to kind of say, well, maybe it's not that big a deal. And unfortunately, the differences were not consistent or attributable to a single source of error, which means there's no correction. We can't just go out there and say, okay, we're going to do it this way and apply a correction factor. So there's a little bit of confusion there. And I guess these are Scott's words. I'll give him credit for that. The optimistic outlook is no one approach is any more or less wrong than the other. So if you can do instantaneous counts, do them. If you can't, well, don't sweat it too much. That's not what the textbook would say, but sometimes reality is what it is. Another way to get effort estimates that don't require being there counting are mail and phone surveys. I know Nancy's talking next about this, and I'm not trying to cause any trouble, but just another comparison we can do. It turns out the angler survey covered a year when we had on-the-ground creel work going on. So the mail survey for this asked people about fishing on Illinois Lake, has generated an angler day estimate for fishing on Illinois Lake in 2007. We had the on the water survey in terms of angler hours. And there's not ideal amount of agreement between these two things. In one case, we have almost a 50% plus difference in how much ice fishing accounted for the total effort on the lake during the year between what we counted and what the mail survey indicated. More importantly, if we take the angler's day estimate from this mail survey and look at our on the lake estimates of effort, in order for those two to agree, for the number of angler days and angler hours we estimated to agree, the average ice fishing trip needed to last 22 minutes, and the average on open water trip needed to last 41, which suggests that the mail survey generated a much higher effort estimate for Oneida Lake during that year than our on the ground survey did, counting boats from the tower. That means there's some disagreement there. What exactly the source of that is and how to reconcile that, I don't know. The other thing we saw, just looking at demographics of the anglers, both the mail survey and the on the lake survey indicate walleye are far and away the most important species fished for on the lake, but not real good agreement between the pan fishermen and bass fishermen in terms of which is most important there. Whether that's because pan fishermen don't mail back surveys, we know bass people like a lot of attention, so I could see them being pretty eager to mail their surveys back. Yellow perch guys might not. A lot of that's semi-commercial fishing, so who knows? But again, some differences between what we got on the water and what came into the mail survey, which we need to bear in mind as we look at different ways to estimate effort. So that's effort. The next level of a creel survey is going to be estimating catch or harvest rates. This involves interviewing anglers. You have to go talk to people and ask them what they've caught, how long they've been out there in order to generate these rate estimates. Two different approaches to this, as in almost all things. Roving surveys, clerk is on the water, going around approaching boats and asking questions. Access point survey, you have the clerk at the ramp, or whatever the exit point is for the lake, interviewing anglers after their trip is over. There are different efficiencies. If you're trying to maximize amount of information for amount of clerk time, roving surveys probably are more efficient in terms of interviews per minute. The clerk can move from boat to boat and stay busy interviewing pretty much constantly as long as there's some effort out there. At the access area, the clerk is waiting for people to leave the lake. They spend a fair amount of time waiting for people to get off the lake. Sometimes they spend a fair amount of time waiting for them to figure out how to get their boat out of the water. And then they interview. So in an 8-hour shift on the water, a clerk can talk to a bunch of people. 8-hour shift at the ramp, there might be waves of people getting off the lake. Our experience is that we get more interviews per hour with the roving survey than the access point survey. But the data we get are also different in terms of what we're getting. With the roving survey, all the anglers on the lake, in theory, have a similar opportunity to be intercepted. There's no reason for one boat to be inaccessible relative to another. But the data are based on incomplete trips. The person's still out there fishing. So you get their catching rate for the amount of time they've been on the water before you intercepted them. And by converting that to your total catch rates, you're assuming the catch rates is constant throughout the trip. That is to say their catch rates or harvest rates don't change between the time you interview them and the time they quit, that everything is equal. Access point, we get complete trip data, so we don't have to worry about that rate assumption. We know their entire trip out there, and they tell us what they caught. But you only capture the anglers who are using the ramps. So maybe not an unbiased or sample of the entire angling population. Convention is that in general, complete trip interviews, that's exit interviews, on the day that they were fishing are best for determining rates. So you don't have recall bias or anything like that. If you catch somebody coming off the water on the day you get the complete trip, they don't have to think back too far about what they caught, and these are the data that people consider most desirable. So should we be concerned about the sampling differences? Now we're talking about the access points, catching a couple of people on the water, sampling, in theory, the whole population. Oneida Lake's big. Our exit interviews take place at 2 state ramps in Wood County Park. So we have people go in there. That's not too bad. If, in fact, that's where almost everyone who fishes the lake accesses it. But if you have a diffuse access lake, this could be a problem. We have pretty good documentation that people have experimented with other ways of accessing our fishery. We had a cargo plane crash into the lake in 1944, so we wouldn't have captured them at a boat ramp. Every now and then a snowmobile goes through the ice, we wouldn't capture them. But what we're mostly talking about is lakes with highly developed shorelines, lots of people with docks in their own boats. They're accessing the lake without having to go through ramps and therefore are not interceptable by the exit clerk at a boat ramp. And this is pretty much what unauthorized access looks like. It's what we call a diffuse access fishery. We're only interviewing at 3 points, but people are hitting the water from all kinds of different areas, private docks, local community docks, marinas. And if you're at one of these 3 ramps, you're going to miss or never have the opportunity to talk to the vast majority of these people. If you're on the water as a roving clerk, you will have an opportunity to intercept them all. So you're sampling different portions of the angling population with those 2 approaches. What we've seen so far is that the difference between the roving and access area mostly bears on how we see the demographics of the fishery. We have not seen pervasive or consistent differences in estimated catch and harvest rates. Nikki Baker has a poster out there. I encourage you to look at it. She's comparing access and roving catch rate estimates. What we do tend to see in terms of difference is that our bass fishery, which is largely tournament driven, draws a lot of out-of-state people. They're using the ramps. So we tend to estimate a higher percentage of anglers targeting bass based on access areas than we do based on the roving areas. So we get a different idea of what the most important fisheries or how the relative importance of the fisheries breaks out. But fortunately, we don't see a big difference in the catch or harvest rates. We took another look at incomplete versus complete trip rates. And this was a postcard survey. So we had a roving survey getting incomplete data. Postcards to the same anglers intercepted for the roving survey to try to get complete trip data. And that's a way to compare those 2. Turns out that the trout folks from Cornell are given a talk on this exact same thing. That means